Since Rings of Powers ended and was scolded to the ground, I made a little list. I've got a little list of contrivances and problems that the Tolkien fans have found. They never would be missed. They never would be missed. The Harfoot Plotpoint never really takes us anywhere. No personal investment that would really make us care. Dependency on member bears to build the bad subplots. All covered in contrivances, all tied up in big knots. The depiction of the characters whose brains have all desist. These problems won't be missed. They'd none of them be missed. He's got them on the list. He's got them on the list. And they'd none of them be missed. They'd none of them be missed. There's the actual good talent that is wasted on the script. I've got that on the list. I've got that on the list. Some moron and his mother-in-law the docs insist be shipped. I've got that on the list. Of course it's on the list. There's the idiot who praises with enthusiastic thought each and every aspect of the show except the plot. The irritating girl boss who he supposedly should like, who'd like to think she modes, but it's really a bad psych. And needlessly, her style girl boss who rules with an iron fist. Her depiction won't be missed. Her depiction won't be missed. He's got her on the list. He's got her on the list. Her depiction won't be missed. Her depiction won't be missed. There's the postmodern haircuts and an otherwise medieval flick. I've got that on the list. Of course it's on the list. The plastic padded armor that makes LARPing look legit.
And the Metropolitan gist. That should be on the list.
And Doomed to Die was an episode of a compromising kind, filled with wacky physics, poor strategies, dumb choices, oh never mind. The poor plot twist that Halbrand was Sauron the entire time. The whole thing is a husk of the social material sublime. It really doesn't matter if docs say that this is bliss. These problems won't be missed. They'd none of them be missed. You may put them on the list. You may put them on the list. And the show will be missed. This show will not be missed.
Hello everybody, ScotsThinker, and let me just start by saying, you all know I'm a Tolkien fan. I've fallen in love with Tolkien's works ever since The Hobbit was read to me, and then I got invested in Peter Jackson's movies, and I also got further invested in the source material of J.R.R. Tolkien himself in various means, whether it be through books and audiobooks narrated by Andy Serkis and the late Sir Christopher Lee. And so, I've gotten myself familiar with Tolkien's works, and due to my own community online, I am getting further informed and enlightened by Tolkien's works. Yes, me and my community of online friends are also big fans of Tolkien, and they all provide their own perspectives and their own unique insights. There was a time in recent memory where Amazon Prime decided to make their own adaptation of Tolkien. Now, fans were overjoyed at first at the mere mention of a television adaptation of Tolkien's works. They reckoned this could be a grand opportunity to finally put the Silmarillion into a visual medium of some kind. Except, according to what I know, there was one major problem for Amazon Prime. They didn't actually purchase the rights to adapt the Silmarillion. Instead, they were barely able to get the rights to adapt certain appendices centered around certain prequel material set in the world of Middle-earth that Tolkien invented. So, okay, they had a bit of trouble with getting licensing, but surely they'll get some passionate storytellers to get this show just right?
Wrong.
Correct me if I'm wrong, there was a proposal from the brothers who directed Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame to direct an Aragorn-themed show set in the Third Age of Middle-earth. Sounds like an excellent opportunity, but they were turned down. Okay, so maybe there was a better idea that they were getting invested in. Oh, who are these showrunners? Okay, they seem interested enough to adapt Tolkien's works. What were their prior experiences of writing? These particular showrunners that they hired had previous experience in writing as being side writers for Star Trek Discovery. Oh no. As time went by, images started to get leaked. At first it seemed somewhat promising, but then Vanity Fair decided to spread promotional imagery for the show, and
Oh no.
Oof. Oh boy. This is going going to be one of those pieces of entertainment, isn't it? Right from the get-go, there seemed to be a very severe misunderstanding on how Tolkien's world building actually works. And so, by the time the first season of the show, called Rings of Power, premiered, the fans' worst fears came true. The show was received really negatively across the board with the Tolkien fanbase. At best, you would say that the Rings of Power series was okay, but the broad majority of Tolkien fans have been willing to gatekeep the lore of Tolkien's world building and then critique Rings of Power. In recent memory, a friend of mine and I watched the first 2 seasons of Rings of Power, and oh boy, it was as atrocious as many of the fans say in many ways, but we were pleasantly surprised by a few other scenes that work in isolation. Note that I said that some scenes in here work in isolation, so I'm going to take a different approach in critiquing Rings of Power. I'm going to mention the positives first before delving into the absolute ocean of problems that this show presents. The positives of Rings of Power is that, as mentioned earlier, yes, there are scenes that work in isolation. There are some moments that actually get Tolkien's sense of world building right. For example, despite the initial backfire of presenting the supposedly first female dwarf, even though we already saw female dwarves within the Unexpected Journey film, if you were actually paying attention, the relationship between Durin III, as well as the character of Dina, the female dwarf, was actually surprisingly wholesome. The acting was genuinely good, and I think out of all the different plot lines people were watching, I think they got the most invested in the plot line with this particular couple because their chemistry on screen seemed very genuine, and you could actually buy them as a genuine dwarven couple. The actress's Scottish accent is very authentic, and they are clearly giving it their all with their acting, and the costumes give the dwarven culture some credibility. However, they have rightly called out the fact that Dina didn't have a beard, which is kind of questionable because in Tolkien's world building it's implied that even female dwarves grow their beards to the point where they're even mistaken for men at times. But regardless, I've noticed in season 2 that Dina did grow some sideburns, so that's good enough. Other positives in the show are scenes involving Isildur's father. His scenes were well portrayed, and he was able to stand up for good in the midst of this political hostility. Other positives in the show are some moments of sincerity between particular characters. A particular scene with the Entwives in season 2, which is really well made. Some occasional moments of spectacle where you finally see where the budget actually went into. There are some creative ideas at play, but the overall context seems to ruin your immersion with those scenes. The depiction of Sauron in the second season is mostly spot on to how he's depicted in the original book source material. Yes, they do take a lot of creative liberties and very questionable choices, but the overall depiction of his manipulative character in season 2, for the most part, is fairly spot on. Scenes like that do work in isolation, but to the top of my memory, I'm sorry, those are the only good things I have to say about the show. I was pleasantly surprised to see that those good scenes did pop up, but oh boy, where do I even begin with how atrocious this entire series is? Start from the beginning, and when you get to the end, stop. It was the Mad Hatter Day recently, in case you didn't realize. Side note, whilst Sauron is mostly depicted well, the things that they get wrong about Sauron, they get really wrong. Like, for example, Sauron is meant to be this Dark Lord demigod who is an agent of the devil figure Morgoth. And yet, according to this show, he started off some guy trying to persuade the orcs, only to be shish kebabbed to death by the orcs, even though he could easily fight back, and later on he could easily manipulate the elves to kill each other, and then manipulate the orcs to kill off Adar, which begs the question, why didn't he just do that in the first place before he got shish kebabbed to death, and then his consciousness transformed into his own blood, which then made him into an oogie boogie venom puddle. Not to mention the whole romantic angle for Guy Ladriel is absolutely absurd. Right, so what is Rings of Power all about? Rings of Power is set during the Second Age of Middle-earth, and it tells the story of how the Rings of Power were made for each of the different groups of peoples of Middle-earth, like the Elves, the Dwarves, and Men, and how all of them were deceived by Sauron and his ploy to take over Middle-earth as the evil Dark Lord. The foundation for a great story is there, but as you will find out later on in this review, this entire show is so stupendously incompetent in trying to tell this narrative that it just boggles the mind of all the decisions. To start off with, there's a lot of contradictions with Tolkien's lore sprinkled throughout the Rings of Power. Now, people might be forgiving of creative liberties, given the fact that it's an adaptation that they're trying to put on TV format, and certainly even Peter Jackson's adaptations took creative liberties, and fans have been critiquing creative liberties within Jackson's works as well. However, there was others who would say that Jackson's works needed those creative liberties in order to make Tolkien's story possible to adapt to film. But even then, Peter Jackson in an interview said, "We didn't want to input our own politics and our own ideologies into it. We wanted to respect Tolkien's traditionalist worldview." You can see that kind of love and passion on the screen. But you don't get that kind of sensible love and passion in this show. Instead, what you get are tons of metropolitan politics that make no sense in this medieval setting whatsoever. Events that are supposed to take place thousands of years in the source material, which for some reason are depicted in a matter of weeks in the Rings of Power show, leading to a lot of character contradictions and plot holes. And the overall story of Rings of Power not only contradicts Tolkien's lore, but it even keeps contradicting itself constantly. So being immersed into the narrative is a fairly difficult thing to do when there's all these problems sprinkled throughout the entire show that the showrunners were somehow completely ignorant about. The reason why I emphasize the constant contradictions that is being made in Tolkien's world building is that I've heard it said that Tolkien's lore was not told to be intended as individual stories. It's meant to be told as a whole. Tolkien's Middle-earth legendarium is one fictional, mythic type story, in which you can't have one installment of it without the other. If you distort the Silmarillion in any specific way, then it fundamentally changes the nature of the Lord of the Rings stories and The Hobbit. Tolkien intentionally wrote the Silmarillion to be in harmony with what he had written beforehand. He didn't write any contradictions in there, and fans celebrate his attention to detail, as well as his dedication to paying homage to European culture and lore to this very day. But that kind of celebration and respect for European culture and lore is not fully approached in Rings of Power at all. In fact, they have very questionable practices that fans have rightly called out, and even given some constructive criticisms, which unfortunately these showrunners seem to be too stubborn to learn from. For example, the promotion of Rings of Power heavily emphasized the inclusion of diversity within Middle-earth. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, before people accuse me of being some kind of racist, which I'm not, it is entirely plausible to have people of different skin colors within Middle-earth. However, it's got to be told in a way that makes sense to the established lore, because the way it's depicted in Rings of Power calls into question how people could breed with so many different cultures of people that quickly within this medieval Northern Hemisphere setting. It doesn't make much sense, and it doesn't really add up. By comparison, there have been other fantasy shows like, say, Game of Thrones that actually make more sense in how it depicts cultural diversity. In Game of Thrones, you have specific people of specific skin colors in specific cultures all throughout the world of Westeros in Game of Thrones. And even in real life, you'll notice if you go around even places like New York or London, or even all these distinct villages and towns throughout the UK, you'll notice that people will usually stick to very specific groups for a sense of belonging. So whenever you visit a certain place, you'll notice a specific group, which gives you a sense of location, geography. Okay, I'm in this location and I'm in their terrain. Okay, I'm going to this location, I'm in their terrain. Okay.
Villages, towns, and city districts all have distinctive character that tells you where you are and that marks those places out from their neighbors. Racial or ethnic conglomeration is one significant part of that. Game of Thrones, which was an incredibly diverse show, understood this point. To a lesser extent, because it was restricted by its narrative, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films did as well. Part of the reason these worlds felt so well realized on screen is that you had immediate visual clues provided by the population separating Dorne from Winterfell in the first instance and the Shire from Bree in the second, for example. But this is now a rare approach. Rings of Power, like Wheel of Time before it, has taken another and less effective one. This is partly because the writers have no real experience of those places in the real world that should serve as inspiration for their creations in the fictional world.
So when I look at Rings of Power, aside from the implication of the dwarves and elven cultures, whose domain am I supposed to be in? Because every single culture, including the people in the desert, including the people who live in the Northern Hemisphere, pretty much every supposed culture depicted in Rings of Power has the cultural diversity of downtown Miami, and it doesn't make sense in this medieval setting. Again, how did people breed that quickly? How can you distinguish one culture from another? It makes it more difficult to fully get immersed in the storytelling. It's obvious that they only included this kind of diversity for political Tolkien. It's obvious that they only inputted this diversity for superficial political reasons rather than for legit immersive storytelling purposes, which is such an immense shame, because there was so many opportunities to have cultural diversity in a way that makes sense in Middle-earth, but they completely skipped those opportunities. Like, for example, I can point to a positive example of cultural diversity actually done right in Tolkien adaptations. For example, in the Hobbit trilogy, when the dwarves and Bilbo reach the city of Lake Town, you'll notice that there's various human beings of various skin colors living in Lake Town and applauding at the promise of retrieving the city of Dale from the tyranny of Smaug. Now, the diversity scene in Lake Town actually makes sense because it was implied earlier in the story that Dale used to be the center for all trade within Middle-earth due to the financial success of Erebor. And so, being the center point of all trade, it would make sense that people from around the world would gather and cultural diversity would happen from therein. So, Peter Jackson rightly observed that, and that kind of cultural diversity makes sense, and it's respectful to not only the people of the skin colors, but also of the source material that he's adapting. Another example of cultural diversity done right would be in the Two Towers movie. Many of you will know exactly the scene I'm talking about. Come on, come out to play! Oh, why are they stuck together? Get off each other, get off! In the Two Towers, you'll recall a scene where Frodo and Sam and Gollum witness these elephants attacking other human beings, and Faramir and his men fight off the invaders who are working for Sauron. Faramir later has a lament about the family and life that one of the men he killed from the east would have had. It's quite an investing scene to remind you that reality is often quite bleak, and it proves that Tolkien's morality is not entirely black and white. Of course, there is absolute good and evil within Tolkien's world building, absolutely, and that should be endorsed. Yet at the same time, things are not that straightforward in Tolkien's world building, and Peter Jackson was smart enough to point that out. Meanwhile, with Rings of Power, I don't sense that these showrunners are very smart in the slightest, because they depict every one of their characters, with the exception of Sauron in many cases, as complete, gullible idiots who will just comply to each other just because the plot needs to be progressed forward and because Sauron needs to manipulate people into crafting the rings.
Something I forgot to add into this review is that the show seems to have an overabundant manner in desperately trying to sound Shakespearean to the point where they overcompensate in overly dramatic metaphors, even when they don't make much sense, or just stupid. Do you want to know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? This is coming from the beta male with the postmodern haircut, giving out this Nietzschean ideology that Tolkien would have disagreed with. Don't bother chasing the real light of joy, instead chase the counterfeits of the water. Do you want to know why a lamppost lights up and we're stuck down here? We are supposed to climb up the lamppost, even risking the segment of touching where the dog has urinated. Because once we reach the light, we achieve enlightenment. Even if we risk blocking off the light to the other people, there are people behind me.
There's so many problems that are interweaved into the narrative, such as supposed mysteries that are either not explained enough or are far too obvious. It's obvious that this is just a way to bait out the series instead of making each season work as its own conclusive story, as if the showrunners are going, ooh, it's a mystery, come on, get invested, ooh, aren't we being so mysterious, ooh.
Don't ask questions, just consume product and then get excited for next product.
You have to tell a complete story, even with each individual season. You can't just leave a story beat in the dark, because what if your show gets cancelled and you don't fulfill a story beat? It's not just the mysteries that often lack a bit of explanation, but also specific plot points that lack explanation. Casual viewers who won't know any better about Tolkien's works will be left out in the dark and be thinking, who on earth is Morgoth? What does this mean? What does that mean? Explain! So it leaves some details like that in the dark, but at the same time, it completely misrepresents other points as well. Suppose, speaking of misrepresentations, we have to talk about the depiction of the characters, because this is where the show gets really insufferable. The overall story was already incompetent enough, but our supposed main characters are just insufferable idiots. We have several plot points in the series, and most of them don't even get resolved, by the way. We do at least have Durin the Third and Dina as the most likable main characters in the show, but everyone else is either a blatant rip-off of characters from Jackson's adaptations, or a very desperate attempt of pandering to superficial ideologies, or both. I think one of the worst parts of the series is the Harfoot Plotpoint, and the reason why it just doesn't work is simply because of how pointless it is. The Harfoot Plotpoint bears little to no grounding in the overall narrative surrounding the actual Rings of Power. It has so little to do with the Rings of Power story, you could pretty much cut out the Harfoot Plotpoint from the entire series from what we've seen of the first 2 seasons so far, and nothing would change. There was only one scene where it correlated in some way, and that was with the scene where Gandalf, for some reason, arrived by meteorite. Oh, but it's not Gandalf! Oh, because he has memory loss! Oh, but wait, it turned out to be Gandalf the whole time! Oh, but people called him Great Elf! Oh, that kind of rhymes with Gandalf! Oh, that's where he got his inspiration, the name from! You have little to no understanding on how European language and Tolkien's language building and linguistics work, do you?
When was the decision made to make him Gandalf, and what was that process and the conversations like around that decision?
And then we had a long conversation between seasons. Gosh, we're going to have to name this guy, right? The story of,
I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause. He's obviously made up his mind. Why don't we just cut our losses and get out of here?
As I was watching the Harfoot Plotpoint in season 2, I was just watching on the screen and I just thought, please correlate. Please correlate. Please correlate! How does this Harfoot Plotpoint tie in to the events of the Rings of Power series? Is there going to be some characters encountering each other? Come on, justify the existence of the Harfoot Plotpoint. Correlate, please! And how do they correlate it? Well, you see, you notice how the 2 main Harfoot characters are blatant rip-offs of Frodo and Sam. At the end of season 2, the Sam ripoff character completely rips off Sam's inspiring speech from The Two Towers. saying some kind of speech showcasing various characters in various locations, including Sauron. Are you kidding me? That's how this plot point correlates with the entire series. Really? That's it? Come on! What a waste of time, especially if you're just going to rip off Sam's awesome speech and not make anything original.
Do you want to know why fences are made of wood?
There's other problems with the Harfoot plot point, such as the fact that the Harfoots seem to be a whimsical death cult, and that's never called into question. I've heard it said that the cultural diversity for the hobbits doesn't make sense in the lore of Tolkien's world building, because hobbits are known to be quite timid of the big folk and the world beyond their borders. So, by that reason, it would make sense as to why the hobbits are predominantly one particular type of skin color. So the various skin colors for all these different Harfoot hobbits doesn't make sense. Again, it's hard to get invested in this kind of world building if the cultural diversity doesn't make sense. There's other plot lines that are fairly problematic, and the most irritatable of them all has to be the one involving Galadriel. Now, many of you will have fond memories of Galadriel from the source material, and especially Cate Blanchett's depiction of Lady Galadriel throughout Peter Jackson's movies. Throughout Tolkien's adaptations, Galadriel's depicted as a 6 foot or so tall, gracious woman who has divine powers. She used to be a witch, but has since repented and has called on the powers of the divine light of Iluvatar, and has thousands of years worth of wisdom and feminine empowerment to help the heroes that she comes across on their journeys. She is one of the best female characters written in recent memory. Oh boy. So what did the showrunners do with Galadriel? Made her an irritating, narcissistic, annoying girl boss. Oh boy. Let's break this down. I grant you this. Lady Galadriel does have the capacity to fight with sword and shield out in the battlefield, but unfortunately, something very sad about modern culture still keeps lingering on, and people are thankfully becoming more aware of this. Mainstream culture seems to actually hate feminine virtues. Now that sounds very bizarre because the mainstream media is all about female empowerment, but the thing is, they've confused female empowerment with toxic masculine traits, which they ironically critique in men, but are not willing to point out in women. You notice that that kind of mainstream media has so many double standards, and they're definitely at play with the Rings of Power's depiction of Galadriel, or as the internet has rightly jokingly called her, Guy-ladriel. So that's what we're going to call her for the rest of this review. So the difference between Galadriel and Guy-ladriel is that Galadriel actually has genuine feminine empowering traits such as nurture, kindness, and wisdom, mainly thanks to the fact that she's an elf and she's had thousands of years to pick up on the wisdom. Meanwhile, Guy-ladriel is irritating, makes irrational choices for a being who's supposed to be thousands of years old, and makes questionable moral choices involving emotional manipulation, leaving her own elf for dead for no justifiable reason, being outright hostile to other parties for no given good reason, and is out for vengeance. She constantly makes these poor decisions, and apparently there's supposed to be a romance between her and Sauron,
Nani?
which is so dumb. I thought we moved on from the Twilight period of phony romances.
Do you want to know why hedges are plants?
The overall depiction of Guy-ladriel is just so unenjoyable. She's so poorly depicted here. This is supposed to be an elf leader who's had thousands of years worth of wisdom, who'd be willing to graciously help others. But this depiction of Guy-ladriel doesn't have much wisdom at all. She keeps making blatantly bad choices, and yet she's supposed to be depicted as the virtuous, pragmatic, feminine girl boss. And it's so annoying to see it all unfold on screen. They've blatantly misrepresented other characters as well. For example, the elves in Tolkien's works are meant to have flowing long hair, but you could still distinguish the men from the women. But in the Rings of Power, almost all the elves have these pre-modern shaven haircuts. The supposed elves of Rings of Power, most of them anyway, are basically human beings who happen to have pointy ears. And you can tell this is the case because there are some elves that are implied to really age, even though that was never really implied in Tolkien's world building.
What?
You see, going back to the whole thing about canon and Tolkien's lore, the showrunners have approached this show as if canon doesn't even matter.
What?
Even Simon Tolkien seemed to be quite the sellout by saying that Peter Jackson's films were too faithful. Too faithful? Too faithful? People have complained that Peter Jackson's movies took too many liberties. And you call them too faithful?
Do you want to know why planes make noises?
What a sellout. If you actually pay attention to Tolkien's own letters and own writings, Tolkien placed a heavy emphasis on the importance of canon within his lore. It's one thing to make creative liberties in the name of a different creative medium, but it's another thing to just break the lore entirely and just try to make your own fantasy. My friend Squidbear has described Rings of Power as very schizophrenic in the fact that it doesn't know if it wants to be its own fantasy or a faithful adaptation of Tolkien's works. It clearly can't be both because the way it tries to do so makes for such a convoluted, blunderous mess. You get other characters that are poorly represented, such as Elrond, who has a very questionable hairstyle for a supposed elf, which has led many people to call him Doogie. And then later on in Season 2, as his hair grew out, I decided to call him Doogie Atreides because his hairstyle very much resembled Paul Atreides in the recent Dune movies.
Listen, I gave.
And Celebrimbor, oh, good grief. What have they done to poor Celebrimbor? Celebrimbor was one of the most awesome characters in the lore. He is arguably the true Lord of the Rings on a thematic and moral basis. And he is the master forger of the rings and plays such an integral role in the lore. And they reduce Celebrimbor to an absolutely pathetic mess. Celebrimbor's supposed to be awesome, not some simple-minded idiot.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Look, I mean no ill will to these actors and actresses for trying their best with the source material they're given, but with that said, a lot of the actors and actresses describe themselves as activists, and being an activist, or at least approaching a work with the primary mindset of being an activist, is not the way you approach storytelling. Especially with Tolkien, who rather famously didn't like allegory, going back to Celebrimbor. He is such a pathetic husk of his source material counterpart that it's led me and my friend Brooks to call this depiction Celebrimbor, making speculation that this supposed perpetrator is actually just a hobbit who drank way too many Ent juice. That's the rational explanation as to why this particular character is so incompetent at what he's doing. There's other blatant misrepresentations and contradictions, such as the fact that the girl boss Guy Ladriel completely replaces other elven characters in the lore, such as Feanor, if I'm not mistaken, and another elf male character, just to give Guy Ladriel some superficial girl boss empowerment, which is so cringeworthy.
Do you know why grass gets wet?
Throughout the show, characters seem to have very confusing motivations. Take, for example, the elf-orc character Adar, for example. He doesn't want Sauron to be in charge of Morgoth's agenda. He doesn't want Sauron to be in charge of the orcs of Mordor. So Adar managed to take over Sauron, and Sauron is trying to get his way back into power to gain vengeance on Adar for taking him over, which doesn't make sense for a reason I'm about to explain. You see, Adar seems to have sympathy towards these orcs, and oh boy, And Adar wants to reconcile the orcs with the elves. Adar, you want to reconcile the elves with the orcs? Okay, if that's your plan the whole time, then why did you send an entire army of orcs to attack Eregion, a city inhabited by elves? The very ones you're trying to reconcile with, you absolute idiot!
Oh no! What happened? Oh no! How terrible! That's just awful! How terrible! Oh no!
Why couldn't you hire the orcs to collaborate with the elves in Eregion to try to hunt down Sauron? You absolute idiot! Oh, but any one of the elves could have been Sauron. Sauron was pretty much showing his true colors by that point. Why did Adar enable the orcs to attack any of the elves? If he's trying to reconcile the elves with the orcs, that doesn't make any sense. His motivations don't make any sense, especially when you consider that in the source material of Tolkien's works, orcs are not meant to be sympathetic individuals. Orcs were formerly tortured elves who were so tortured and crippled that any semblance of their soul has now passed on and gone, and what remains are these zombified husks that come out from incubates, get slapped some armor and weapons on, and their first question is, what do I kill and destroy? Orcs are zombified monsters that have no semblance of the elven souls that used to inhabit their husks. Orcs are monsters in Tolkien's world building. They're not the sympathetic creatures you'd get from World of Warcraft. Orcs are demonic monsters. There's so many simple bits of Tolkien's lore that they cannot get right. But I might as well just cut to the chase, to the two worst possible aspects of Rings of Power. One of the worst possible things of Rings of Power is episode 7 of season 2, appropriately titled Doomed to Die. It tries to depict this epic battle of the Siege of Eregion, but the strategies and the tactics and the methods of their motivations of all these different characters are so blatantly stupid that the whole thing is just such a trash pile. Like, seriously, people have spent hours breaking down just how stupid this one episode is. I could go on and on about how stupid it is, but I suppose, let me give you a wee taste. There's a scene where Dougie Atreides, who's supposed to be Elrond, smooches Galadriel, even though in the lore, Galadriel is Elrond's mother-in-law. Oh my days.
The kiss.
Ah, yes. It never occurred to us that it was strange. It made perfect sense to us.
What? What?
They love each other in a platonic way, and they've been battling all season, and he thinks she's going to die, and he's got to get close enough to slip a pin to her. And he's saying goodbye to her, and he's apologizing. Forgive me for the liberty I'm about to take in kissing you, and forgive me for, being so hard on you all season.
And yes, he is kissing his future mother-in-law, which,
Well, but he doesn't know that yet. 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 He doesn't know that yet.
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next product.
It never struck us as provocative or stirring the pot.
What? And Celebrimbor, the supposed master forger, gets himself stuck in handcuffs and tries to get his hand out of the cuff. So he sees a metal cutter. Okay, the logical thing to do would be to cut the metal and make a run for it. But what does he do? He cuts his own thumb off to get set free. This show is full of incompetent morons. This show is full of gullible idiots.
Do you know why puddles are wet?
the worst part of the show, the part of the show that enraged me the most, has to be scenes revolving around the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2. This is where it gets the most infuriating for me, so spoiler alert, but who cares? So it turns out that Halbrand was Sauron the whole time in season 1. When Galadriel does her research on the Halbrand bloodline, she notices that it contradicts the person who claims to be Halbrand. At that point, this perpetrator says, "I have had many names," showcasing the obvious plot twist that Halbrand was Sauron the whole time. Sauron offers Galadriel the opportunity to rule the world together, but Galadriel refuses, because, girl boss and stuff like that. But, Galadriel would have refused anyway, but this whole shipping thing is nonsense. So, the Rings of Power are forged, and Galadriel is noticing that the rings have some kind of link with Sauron. Keep in mind, it is established that Galadriel was trying to avenge her brother by trying to locate Sauron for thousands of years. And even though Galadriel was trying to look for Sauron for thousands of years, she didn't once come up with alternative solutions to try to find the source of this mark. There's a scene where they flip this sort of symbol in a way that resembles part of a map. Galadriel, you've been investigating for thousands of years, and not once did it occur to you, maybe if we just flip upside down or something? Did that not occur to you even once? Come on! Thousands of years? Yeah, right, more like tens. But that's not the most infuriating part. Oh, no. That's not the most infuriating part I'm talking about. It's specifically what happens afterwards. For you see, Galadriel refuses to tell Celebrimbor who Sauron actually is, because she's in love with Sauron and she has conflicting romantic feelings about him. That's infuriating enough as it is. Just But what makes this moment even worse is that in that scene at the end of season 1, Dougie Atreides, who's supposed to be Elrond, finds the same piece of evidence that pinpoints the fact that Halbrand was Sauron all along. Dougie reads that same bit of evidence that Galadriel found, and he is in the same room as Galadriel and Celebrimbor, and Dougie is in more of a mentally stable position to tell everyone that Halbrand was Sauron all along, especially to Celebrimbor, and yet he stays silent! Why? Why did you remain silent? Were you trying to be polite? Were you trying not to hurt Celebrimbor's feelings? Even though you were looking for Sauron for thousands of years? Is this some kind of formal thing where you're not allowed to speak up or something? What is going on? And this incompetency plays an impact throughout the show, especially leading all the way up to the worst episode of the series, Doomed to Die. In other words, if Dougie Atreides had just told Celebrimbor that Halbrand was Sauron, that Sauron is back, or if Galadriel would have actually sucked it up and told Celebrimbor anyway, none of the events of the Siege of Eregion would have probably happened. Oh my days. Honestly, I could go on and on about the many problems of the series, but you get the idea. The show is incredibly incompetent, incredibly annoying. They completely bastardize Tolkien's lore. They have mutilated Tolkien's lore for superficial brownie point purposes. And it overall, despite the scenes that work in isolation, it makes for such an incompetent watch. And honestly, that's not even the half of it. What I'm telling you is only the tip of the iceberg with how poorly this series portrays Tolkien's lore, with how much this series contradicts itself at times. I could go on and on and on, bit by bit, about every single thing, every questionable editing cut, every fake-looking plastic costume that would make a LARPer look more credible, every single bit of fight choreography that makes it look as if they're not even trying to hit them at times and they're waiting for their cues. I could mention all these forced elements, all the questionable character choices, all of it, but I'll just leave it for my fellow fans in the comments to rant about just how incompetent this series is. What did you think of Rings of Powers? If you thought it was okay at best, feel free to justify your case. I'd be happy to hear it. But if you're willing to just rant about Rings of Power like I did, I'd happily welcome it also. ScotsThinker, signing out. Get the whiskey out for Season 3. I rank the Rings of Power series a 2 3/4 out of 12. I rate it slightly better than The Acolyte, because yes, there are a lot of similarities between The Acolyte and Rings of Power in regards to just how awful those series are, but I'd say Rings of Power is better than The Acolyte because, like I said before, some scenes in Rings of Power work in isolation, and The Acolyte is a narrative made out of pure spite, whereas Rings of Power is a narrative that's made mostly out of pure incompetency, but also with a bit of spite in there. But with The Acolyte, it's made from pure spite, which I consider to be morally far worse. Thank you so much for watching.
He's got them on the list! He's got them on the list! And